Welcome to the Center for American Progress. Thank you for joining us for today's event. We'd like to ask you to please silence your mobile devices. If you've brought a laptop or a tablet, please mute notifications or put these items on disturb. When our question and answer period, please raise your hand and a microphone is brought to you. Remember to state your name and affiliation. Please, one question per guest. Thank you again for being present. The event will start soon.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Nicole Gentili. I'm the Senior Director for Conservation here at CAP. And on behalf of the Center for American Progress and for National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, I'd like to thank everyone both online and here in person for joining us today. CAP was recently very proud to partner with NCEL on a report that explored state-level policies for land conservation that are being deployed all across the country. Today, we are very excited to have a panel with some true state conservation leaders where we will learn from them directly about this progress and dive deeper into the opportunities that lay ahead. Facing the nature and climate crises head-on will take action at all levels. We are losing nature at an alarming pace, and the climate crisis is consistently driving really depressing headlines. And speaking for myself, although I feel many people in the room and online today might share this sentiment, working in environmental and conservation policy can really be overwhelming at times. But the examples we'll hear about today and other actions taking place all across the country give me hope that we can tackle the climate and conservation crises. And speaking of hope, I have the great honor of welcoming to the stage now someone who brings me a lot of hope. In cynical Washington, D.C., the fact that someone as genuine and as dedicated as Chair Mallory sits at the White House Council on Environmental Quality and leads President Biden's conservation and environmental policy is inspiring. With nearly 2 decades of experience working at EPA and experience as the senior counsel at CEQ under President Obama, Chair Mallory is an accomplished public servant. I've also had the great pleasure of working alongside her in the nonprofit sector, where her vision and her leadership helped to set the stage for the bold and historic conservation goals that she is now in charge of implementing. She's a champion for clean water, for protected lands, and for environmental justice, and she leads her team with care and with compassion. She's also a serious lawyer who somehow manages to find the joy and the humor in almost any situation. So we are lucky to have Chair Mallory at the White House and very lucky to have her here with us today. So please join me in welcoming Chair Brenda Mallory to the stage.
Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be here, and hello to the folks who are on the line. I always enjoy coming to CAP because these are people who I've had the privilege of working with for a long time in many different from many different vantage points. And so it's just wonderful to kind of see us all as we're evolving in our individual careers and as we're evolving in helping an administration sort of move forward with their missions. President Biden and Vice President Harris are two people who are so connected on the things that are important to this group. And I would say I want to join Nicole's comment about, getting some encouragement from the work that the people in this room are doing. I think we were just talking yesterday about how the work happening all across the country in the conservation area is just such a great example of that notion of states being laboratories to help federal policies actually develop as we watch what you're doing and what works. And so I'm very encouraged to see what's happening across the country. I'm sorry I won't be able to listen to the panelists as they're speaking, but I have read the report. So anyway, good afternoon. Just as I just said, it's a pleasure to be here and to have a chance to speak for a moment to people who across the country are so committed in building a better future. As the chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality, I advise the president and work with federal agencies all across the government to advance a range of environmental conservation and climate change policies. And working with communities, states, local officials is really critical to all of the work that we do, but particularly in CEQ, which is very much anchored in the importance of that interconnection, both across the government, but also with communities across the country. That's the history of CEQ in some ways. I think in part because the National Environmental Policy Act is among the things that we are responsible for implementing. And so that actually by its nature really emphasizes that important role of working across the country. I think we all understand that the world faces unprecedented challenges as climate change disrupts ecosystems, drives extreme weather, jeopardizes our precious natural resources, leaving communities across the country really vulnerable. We know that the most severe harms from the climate crisis fall disproportionately on communities that are least able to prepare for and recover from these climate events. And so that fact is very much an anchor to why President Biden and Vice President Harris are stepping forward and meeting this moment with the most ambitious climate conservation and environmental justice agenda in our nation's history. As all of the work that we are doing is very much anchored in a belief that every person deserves clean air, clean water, and a healthy environment. Through the president's Investing in America agenda, including the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act, we are making historic investments to tackle the climate crisis, address legacy pollution, and protect our lands and waters. So far, this administration has removed hazardous fuel material from nearly 15 million acres of land to protect communities from wildfires, funded nearly 500 projects for water recycling, storage, conservation, and desalination, plugged nearly 8,000 orphan oil and gas wells, allocated funding to 95 previously unfunded Superfund site projects. And these are just a few examples of the work that's happening all across the country right now. President Biden has also laid out a bold conservation agenda. His signature conservation policy, the America the Beautiful initiative, sets the goal of conserving at least 30% of the lands and waters, of U.S. lands and waters by 2030. 8 states have also adopted the 30 by 30 goal explicitly, and other states are doing something similar. And altogether, we are making great progress towards realizing the goals. So far, the president has taken action to conserve more than 41 million acres of lands and waters, putting him on track to conserve more lands and waters than any president in history. We've protected places like the Tongass National Forest, Bristol Bay, the Boundary Waters, Chaco Canyon, the Thompson Divide, and the Western Arctic, to name a few. But we know that there's much more that needs to be done. And we also know that we can't do this work alone. So just so grateful for the work that is happening out among the states and all that you are doing, and the opportunity that we have to really work together. The America the Beautiful initiative that the president created is really built on the notion of locally led, nationally scaled initiatives. And so we have been out and making those connections that are necessary to identify projects that we really are able to kind of help leverage based on the funding that's currently available. As part of the America the Beautiful initiative, we recently announced bold new national goals to restore, reconnect, and conserve 8 million acres of wetlands and 100,000 miles of rivers by 2030. 7 states have signed on in partnership with this initiative, and tribal and local leaders are committed to advancing freshwater conservation, and more entities are joining us now. Through the America the Beautiful Challenge, a public-private grant program, we're providing states and tribes with funding for locally led ecosystem restoration projects. Over the past 2 years, the challenge has awarded over $230 million for projects advancing watershed restoration, climate resilience, nature access, and more. We also recently launched the conservation.gov, a resource hub to help connect people with information, tools, resources, and opportunities to support land and water conservation in communities across the country. The new website will help people find places to recreate outdoors, opportunities to volunteer on public lands, and more. It can also connect communities with grant opportunities. Building on decades of work by California leaders, President Biden also recently expanded the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument and the Berryessa Snow Mountain National Monument. This will safeguard those lands and expand access to the outdoors for communities today and for future generations. These expansions were done with the support of the state of California and help to meet the state of California's 30 by 30 goal, as well as our own national conservation goal. It exemplifies how federal-state partnerships can expand the scale and the impact beyond what we each are able to do alone. I've seen the work happening at a state and local level, and I've been so inspired by the focus and dedication that exists at the local level. And 21 states have made major conservation investments in the last year and are taking more creative initiatives to expand conservation and protect public lands and waters. Together, we can undertake the long-term efforts needed to meaningfully tackle the climate crisis and biodiversity challenges that we face. Our success depends on our ability to collaborate effectively. We must forge new partnerships, deepen existing partnerships, share best practices, and welcome new leaders into the conservation movement from every level of government, philanthropy, communities, and beyond. And a theme that we talk a lot about in the Biden administration relates to broadening who's in the room and being open and more taking more ambitious action to ensure that all communities are represented in the work that we're doing, particularly in conservation. So that is a very important part of how we see the new opportunities for including partners in the work that we're doing. So I'm just grateful today for what you all are doing. I'm grateful for the fact that CAP is convening this group, and I really look forward to hearing what comes out of the discussions over the next few hours. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Chair Mallory. I'll invite all of our panelists up, and while they're getting settled, just wanted to echo a few of the comments that I heard from Chair Mallory that I wrote down. One is that states are laboratories. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Oh, good. All good. Yeah, one is that states are laboratories, and I think this panel especially is able to kind of demonstrate what has been cooked up in those laboratories and how they can be, like she said, locally led and nationally scalable. So wanted to pull that out, and also just wanted to name that she mentioned that every person deserves access to clean air, water, and a healthy environment, which is not one of our civil rights in the Constitution, but is inherent to all of us. And so just wanted to name that you're all here and share that value. I think if you don't share that value, then you might be in the wrong room. Anyway, so good morning, everybody. My name is Kate Burgess. I'm the Conservation Program Manager with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. Thank you so much to CAP for co-hosting this event. We're really excited to be here. And so we're going to transition to our panel today. I feel like Kelly Clarkson on her talk show, but I'm not going to sing, don't worry. So like Chair Mallory mentioned, CAP and NCEL just put out a state leadership to conserve nature report, which is out there if you have a couple hours to kill and a nice glass of wine, unwind with some state policy interventions. And it really highlights some best practices for conserving land and water. And I think this panel is really the physical manifestation of this report. We often call state test kitchens, and you are looking at some of the best chefs in the country. So let's learn. And so I first want to introduce our panelists, and then I have a question for all of you. And I'll also say for the audience, at the end of our little panel, we invite you to ask some questions. So take some notes. Let's learn together. Okay, I'll start with you, Jonathan. Jonathan Asher is the director of the Governor's Office of Climate Preparedness in Colorado, which is a focused climate adaptation effort within the governor's office created after the devastating Marshall Fire. And Jonathan serves as the governor's top policy advisor on conservation, public lands, and more. He returned home to Colorado after 15 years here in DC, got a little too muggy for you probably, where he served on the Hill in the Obama administration and at conservation NGOs, including the Wilderness Society. State Representative Cristina Ortiz from New Mexico. As a longtime land and water conservation champion, she represents New Mexico's 42nd district in Taos County and served as the executive director of Taos Land Trust for 10 years, where she worked with elected leaders to develop legislation to protect and expand public and private lands and clean water for all New Mexicans. She currently sits on the board of the Land Trust Alliance. I know we have a couple of those folks here, and is a proud mom to 2 daughters in Taos. Dr. Jen Norris is the executive director for the California Wildlife Conservation Board, and notably is the first woman to hold a position in the board's 76-year history, Queen. And before coming to WCB, Dr. Norris led California's 30 by 30 initiative as deputy secretary for biodiversity and habitat at the California Natural Resources Agency, another first for California, which set a really ambitious precedent and area-based conservation target example for other states. And she's also worn a couple of hats for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, delivering innovative, large-scale conservation projects. Senator Sarah Alfrith, last but not least, from Maryland, is the youngest woman ever elected to the Maryland Senate, slay, representing Annapolis and Anne Arundel County. And in her first 5 years in office, she demonstrated an incredible ability to work across the aisle, helping to pass 84 bills, all with bipartisan support, which is unprecedented these days. And I recently saw her quoted in an article saying that easily 30% of her legislative agenda is environmental, which is quite apt considering she was the lead sponsor for the Maryland the Beautiful Act, which set 30 by 30 and 40 by 40 goals for the state, some of the most ambitious in the country. And she also just won the Democratic primary for Congress. So very excited. Congratulations. It's a pretty awesome panel. So nature definitely has some really strong allies in you all. let's start with a question for you all. So I want to start by painting a picture of how land conservation fits into the political agenda in your state. So why and how has land conservation resonated politically in New Mexico, Colorado, California, and Maryland? Let's start with you, Representative.
Thank you so much for that question. Can you all hear me okay? Wonderful. I think in the last 6 years, conservation has become really at the forefront of electoral politics in New Mexico. And recently, just in the last 2 years, have we been able to fund it at the levels that that are required to make a difference in local communities. Just 2 years ago, in 2023, January 2023, we invested $100 million for state conservation through the Land of Enchantment Legacy Fund. And that is historic. It's really the first time many of these programs have been funded, programs that exist already. We had the laws for them, but we didn't have any money in the pots, right? So this was the first time we've been able to do that. But those programs are really oversubscribed in terms of the interest at the local level by something like 6 to 20 times. So for there were like $20 million of requests for $1 million that was available. That I think speaks to the local counties and regions' interest in conservation. And we need way more money to do the work that we need to do to build resiliency in communities. I'm going to stop there unless you want me to continue.
That's perfect
Okay, good.
for now. Let's go to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, I will echo everything that was just said. I think, spending a lot of time in DC, then coming back to Colorado, we don't have a huge budget. Like, you talk about numbers at the federal level, ours are much smaller. But even so, it's incredibly important. And I think that's one of the key, elements that in coming into Colorado and kind of from a background in DC, I and we have really tried to have a focus on is growing that pot of resources in the state for us to be able to invest in conservation projects and do them in a smart and efficient way with, the limited dollars that we do have. There's not a huge overlap, right, between like crunchy granola outdoor nature lovers and like finance experts. But there needs to be more of them, right? Because one of the best things that I think we have done and continue to want to do more of in Colorado is figure out those tools to grow the pot in an efficient way. And that doesn't just mean like tacking on new fees to everything and everyone, but it means figuring out, kind of creative ways that we can grow those pot of resources. So I completely echo the funding need and opportunity. For what it means to Coloradans in general, I think for anyone that has recently saw last weekend our amazing outside festival, and encourage everyone to come to that next year. It's going to be even bigger and better, but it just underscores that Colorado is such an epicenter for outdoor recreation, and that is a fantastic thing. It's a fantastic thing for our economy. It's a fantastic thing for diversifying our economy. It also means that we're increasingly having to think about how we do it right and how we do it responsibly. And so, in Colorado, I think to your average Coloradan, kind of to your question of like, how is conservation perceived in the state? It is completely a win-win-win, but we're needing to, I think, increasingly have those conversations with different communities about what that looks like in a detailed way and how we do it. Because particularly in 2020 and 2021 and after, so many people with flexibility in their work places of work and where they could be came to places like Colorado, and not just Denver. They like came to small towns and lived and worked there. And we just saw so many more people on the landscape than we had ever seen before, that led to all kinds of, crazy new situations, from, just competition between different types of users on the landscape and how do they get along, to even like public health issues where we had so many people out dispersed camping that it was impacting a local community's water, resources, because people have to go to the bathroom somewhere, right? And so there's a lot of new challenges. And I think that is a twofold world where, one, it's great because it's in the forefront of everyone's mind in Colorado, where the things that we've worked to move forward that are pro-conservation and kind of innovative next steps, everybody's been on board, from, from Republicans in the state legislature who have been some of our best bipartisan champions, to, my boss, Governor Polis, who sees the need and has been, a full-on ardent supporter of, let's get this done, let's grow our resources, let's improve the system, not just for short-term fixes, but create those mechanisms and opportunities that will really allow us to have long-term opportunities as we improve the state. And conservation is core to that, both the climate and biodiversity crisis elements.
Thanks, Jonathan. Senator?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here to have this important conversation. So in Maryland, we passed 30 by 30 a couple years ago, and we actually just last month met that goal, which is really exciting. And that's a round of applause. We knew that when we did the bill, so that's exactly why we set a more ambitious bill of 40 by 40. And so we're on track to meet that, but it's going to take some more work. We have a really great history in Maryland of funding. It's never going to be enough, similar to every other state, but we've had what we call program open space, which is funded through a transfer tax, a real estate tax. And that has done a great job of conserving land. But like any good policy issue, it's going to evolve and the pressures evolve. And I think our two greatest pressures, similar to every other state in a different way, but climate change. We are in Maryland, the second most vulnerable state to sea level rise. And we had not thought about land conservation from that angle as both a defense, but also a way to help absorb and react to it. And the second pressure, I think, again, is similar to everybody else, is about access. We've done a really great job of conserving land, but then we kind of put up a fence and we don't let anybody in because we don't want to pay for the staff to actually let that land be open to the public. And that's created tremendous pressure, similar to Colorado, particularly post-pandemic, that our state parks were loved to death. And our state park staff was not able to keep up. And that then led to another bill, the Great Maryland Outdoors Act that I sponsored, that invested $200 million in our state parks. And more importantly, kind of set an agenda for where we should not just conserve land, but open up access, which is really around the center of the state where we're more populated and frankly more diverse. We need to look at opportunities for public water access because that is a huge equity issue in Maryland. Who has access to the Chesapeake Bay and who doesn't? And then who cares about the Chesapeake Bay and who might not have the opportunity to? We also thought about opportunities for transportation. Not everybody has a car, but everybody should live near a park that they can access. And then we thought about the cultural stories we needed to tell better in Maryland. So we really put aside funding for African-American history, which was until we have one state park dedicated to Harriet Tubman, but we hadn't thought strategically about what other conservation opportunities do we have to tell those important stories and make them front and center in someone's experience when they visit a state park. So those are the pressures that we're responding to, and there will be new ones along the way, but we are starting the journey in Maryland.
Thank you, Senator. Jen?
Well, also, thank you for having us. This is a great conversation. Can you hear me? I can hear myself. Okay, cool. I would say ditto to everything everyone else said. California, of course, is a huge economy. So we're operating at a scale that's really different. We were talking earlier that I came from New Mexico and the resources are very different. But our history in California, I think, is really like nature is part of the ethos of what it means to be a Californian, our beaches, our mountains. It's sort of part of our personality and our character. So conservation has always had a really strong place in our economy, both for outdoor recreation, but also just sort of as an ethic. And we've also had, incredibly strong laws to protect biodiversity and to protect nature for a very long time. California has its own Endangered Species Act. It has its own Environmental Quality Act. And so for those reasons, we've done a lot of conservation, and we also recognize sort of where biodiversity fits into all of these issues. But what I think is really notable in the last few years is that the Newsom administration made an active push to link conservation and climate change into one place. And so recognizing that functional ecosystems are essential in the fight against climate change, that you need You need coastal wetlands to help you with sea level rise. You need functional rivers to help with flooding. You need forests that don't burn. We had a year with 4 million acres burned in one summer in California. And that really brought it to, and that was while we were all on lockdown. So it was quite terrifying. The skies were orange. And it really brought it to the forefront for folks that, we need our ecosystems to actually take care of us. And so linking them to climate change and to the governor's goals for a carbon neutral future, there have been incredible investments actually in conservation and restoration in our 2021-2022 budgets, where we had an incredible surplus. We put aside $1.4 billion for conservation, and we managed to spend about $800 million before our economy sort of turned around, and we lost some of that funding to some budget challenges we're going through right now. But I'm now part of the agency that gets to do that. We invest a lot of money with partners. We work with our federal partners, our local partners to do land conservation and restoration. And I would touch on the equity issue as well. I think we all experienced, what happened during the pandemic. One, that some people really had access to the outdoors. In California, we were sort of under pretty strong requirements to not leave our county. And so, or not go more than 5 miles from your home. There were all kinds of different variations on this, but lots of people had nowhere to go. And many people had wonderful places to go. And that inequity became really glaring. And then there were also, of course, the, justice conversations that brought not only just equity writ large, but also tribal conversations really became central in California. And so we've coupled our approach to conservation, 1, biodiversity, 2, access to nature, but 3, really trying to right some of the historic wrongs that we have in California. Our governor, one of the first things he did when he took office was actually to issue an apology to California Native American tribes for state-sponsored genocide. And now we've been on a journey to really make changes. And so we've been actually working on land return, co-management, and providing access for cultural activities. So all of that together, I would say, is part of what makes us proud to be Californians, but it's not without its challenges. We're also an economy that is moving forward and building lots of things that are taking out habitat. And so there's always that tension, and we're always looking for the sort of best way to do that. But I think 30 by 30 gave us sort of a common goal and a common language to push that initiative forward in a way that's been, I think, really positive for us, and hope we can talk more about that.
Yeah, thank you all. I think I'm hearing some ubiquitous pressures. I know you talked about access, environmental justice, this piece of kind of repenting before repairing, especially with tribal nations and honoring their self-determination, thinking about conserving all of this land, and then who gets to go there, who gets to enjoy it and achieve the benefits of nature. And then I'm also hearing this kind of interest without capital conversation, that, TiVos and Wall Street don't really go together very often, and that there's interest, but we just need kind of the support to stand it up. And kind of this broader conversation about, linking conservation and climate as concomitant crises. And I always think about, I was at the COP for Biodiversity in Montreal last year, and it just happened after the climate, or it's 2 years ago, after the climate COP, and everybody was talking about the climate COP. And there are a couple of people there who'd gone to both. And I said, well, are people talking about 30 by 30 and the Convention on Biological Diversity at the climate COP? And they said, no, nobody's talking about biodiversity at the climate COP, but everybody was talking about climate at the conservation COP. So just appreciate that piece, Jen, there. I want to dive in a little bit deeper, state-based for each of you. So I'll start with New Mexico. If I may, underrated. For a part-time legislature, you're certainly bringing up full-time results. And you mentioned the Land of Enchantment Fund. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that story and where it's at now.
Yeah, absolutely. We are underrated. In fact, many people come to New Mexico from Colorado because their trails are oversubscribed. A lot of folks in Colorado, and New Mexico is beautiful. My district borders Colorado, and we share a lot of biodiversity and beauty. So come visit. We are a part-time legislature. We're also the last unpaid legislature. So people like me have to have full-time jobs. And I just left my full-time job as an executive director of the Taos Land Trust, where I was, I led that organization for 10 years. So I'm impressed with myself as well, that we're able to get the work done. You have a lot of committed people who work really hard. And the reason we're able to do the things that we're able to do is because of the advocates. Some of you who are in this room who have helped us shape policy and think through how we can make our state more resilient to climate change. We're an oil and gas state as well. 50% of our budget comes from oil and gas drilling. So it's really hard to have these conversations about how we can, reduce greenhouse gases, because it means that schools will go unfunded or underfunded. So that's a really difficult conversation to have. And then you overlay the need to make our lands resilient while we, have the funding we need to just to run the state. So I think that's why the Land of Enchantment Legacy Fund is so beautiful and remarkable, because you had a group of kind of what I'd like to call strange bedfellows, unlikely partners coming together to get the funding to protect land and water. Soil and water groups. We're working with, with agriculture folks, with outdoor recreationalists, with, people who represent wildlife organizations. Acequias, you may not know what an acequia is, but it's a ditch. It's the oldest form of government in New Mexico as well. So it's not just infrastructure, but it's a form of government and a way of thinking. So all these people came together over many years to get funding. And for the first couple of years, I think it was 2019 when we first tried to get it funded. I was not in the legislature then, and the fight really was over acquisition, using state funding to acquire more land. And that was something that really drove a wedge between parties, between the ag folks, between the conservation folks. We couldn't find common ground. And for 2 years, that fight it didn't move forward. We weren't able to get anything happening. And then we brought more people in, tribal nations, more acequias, and started to have the conversation really around resiliency and how we needed to invest in our local communities so that we could be prepared for things like the 300,000 acre wildfire that burned in my backyard. At the same time, there was another wildfire that was burning in the southern part of the state. So, these are that fire, I think, actually really helped kind of solidify, those fires helped solidify that need to work together. And we were able to pass that legislation. It's not enough money. I mean, really, at the end of the day, it's only $12.5 million for multiple agencies who work on land and water, river restoration, acequias, agricultural lands, working lands. It's not enough money. And forget about habitat for wildlife. That there's some money there, but it's like $1.5 million, $2 million. That's not nearly enough to do the work that we need to do. So, I'm really amazed that we were able to set aside some differences, and we still can't talk about acquisition. It really makes people very, very uncomfortable. And as an executive director who worked on, protecting land forever, it was even more difficult to have that conversation. So I'm excited about it, but we have so much more to do. We need $500 million, $1 billion.
Aim high.
Yeah,
$1 trillion. Why not? No, I do want to applaud you, because that is New Mexico's first ever dedicated source of revenue for conservation. So that's a big deal, and just appreciate all of your efforts on that. And kind of on this thread of funding, I want to go to you, Jonathan. Before this, we talked about the Keep Colorado Wild Pass and the Colorado Outdoor Strategy, which helped fund Colorado's 42 state parks, state wildlife action plan, and also kind of refined a plan for conservation, recreation, climate resilience, funded by the lottery. And so I want to hear you talk a little bit more about some of those creative pots of funding that you mentioned. And I know recently Colorado just passed that really significant production fee for oil and gas, which would bring in $30 to $50 million in revenue every year for conservation. So talk to us a little bit more about creative pots of funding.
Yeah, happy to. And I wasn't going to be the one to rip off the state versus state Band-Aid, but
Catch chili.
since it's been ripped off, don't get a Coloradan start to talk about California.
Okay. Oh.
Bring it.
I know. There you go. That being said, no, but in all seriousness, I mean, I'm sitting up here and I just like my wheels are starting to turn. I'm just like identifying with everything that all the other panelists are saying, and it's a phenomenal, I think, time that we're in where I think Chair Mallory was spot on, right? Where it's like states are such a great test kitchen is the way that you put it. And I think we're recognizing that role and trying our best to take that on and really like run full steam with it, particularly from the perspective of looking at these issues, trying to de-silo the issues more and more, right? It's not a biodiversity issue. It's not conservation. It's not climate. These are all things that are interconnected. How do we start to think in a government level about interconnecting them and thinking about them in interconnected ways and making policy and coordinating and organizing our agencies to think about them in that way, right? And so, my office is a key example of that after the Marshall Fire, investing a lot of funding in recovery. The state legislature and our leadership created my office to really start to bring these things together. It's not just about, climate adaptation, which is kind of the main focus, but climate adaptation, a key part of that is the biodiversity crisis. A key part of that is conservation. A key part of that is coordination amongst our offices and thinking about how we do things in a more data-driven, more aware and coordinated way. On the funding piece, like I said, we recognized, I think, quite a while ago that, the conservation of our lands and wildlife and waters in Colorado is something that we have a huge stake in at a state level. And it's not something that, that the federal government or Congress, we love them, please keep sending us money, but they're not going to come and save us anytime soon. So we need to be thinking about how we grow our own pots and how we create those partnerships that will allow us to do the work we want, without just sitting around and, writing a letter during appropriate season that says, please send us more money, right? So with that in mind, a few of the mechanisms that we've started to put into place. One, I have to give a huge shout out to Great Outdoors Colorado. And this was an effort that was started 30-ish plus years ago, that really dedicated lottery revenue in Colorado directly to conservation through a constitutional amendment. Now Ambassador Salazar was instrumental in that, and it is a legacy for Colorado that we are looking for ways to add on to and bolster and grow continuously. So have to give a quick shout out to GOCO, which is amazing. GOCO has taken full on this view and understanding of how do we coordinate, how do we look at things holistically, and how do we bring all of our key conservation partners, GOCO, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the Gov's office and others together, and regional partnerships, which we've established in Colorado to really have project level coordination between our federal land management agencies, local governments, conservation interests, recreation interests. How do we bring them all together around a better plan and better data to understand how we do conservation in a meaningful way? So really for us, right, when we talk about sort of the 30 by 30 question, I think for Colorado, we've taken that question and said, hey, we want to make sure we're doing it in a really understanding and detailed way and thoughtful way. We don't want to just create another reservoir and call it conserved and then get our 30%, right? Like we need to be figuring out what is biodiverse, lands, what are resilient lands, what are the key places that we need to be thinking about conserving, and how do we think about conservation in a way that is going to set us up to be thriving in a climate impacted future and taking into consideration what the future looks like through a scientific way, including indigenous knowledge, working that into our understanding of what is science. And so that effort is called the Colorado Outdoor Strategy. That's one of the things you mentioned, Kate, and is a great partnership. And that's something that has been funded largely by GOCO so far, but is a partnership between GOCO, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and many others that we're putting together to really drive a coordinated system. The other kind of creative element that you've mentioned, we just, to the point about how much of our revenues often come from oil and gas, there's a ton in Colorado that comes from oil and gas, right? So we've kind of taken an approach of thinking, how do we try and get forward progress right now without just getting mired in a decades-long fight between different battling ballot initiatives, right? That just keeps us all stuck. So with huge credit to my boss, this last session, through a lot of negotiations, came out of the end with a deal with oil and gas, conservation partners, everybody at the table together to put down the ballot fights and think about kind of the future. And out of that, we've come with about 30 plus or minus additional $1 million per year that we're going to be able to invest in conservation. In addition, the other part of the deal was a heck of a lot more, and I'm less familiar with the total number, but that's going to go to transit and transit-oriented development and that type of stuff, which we hope to do, Front Range Rail between Wyoming and New Mexico. So let's all get together and talk about that. All that being said, again, very early on, we also passed what's called the Keep Colorado Wild Pass. And so for such a long time, right, so many of our conservation dollars come from the sportsman's world, and that's incredibly important and incredibly valuable. But it's just not enough to keep up with the need. And so we've wanted to look for how do we create more opportunities for your average Coloradan, everybody that benefits from the outdoors, to be investing in, the care and well-being of those outdoors. So with our car registrations now, Coloradans have the ability to purchase a statewide state parks pass that will also now increasingly include some federal parcels that brings the total cost of the state parks pass from $89 down to $29 and expands the universe of people that can buy it. So instead of having a small amount of people that are interested in buying, a product and it's expensive, now we're opening up that to every citizen in Colorado who drives a car and is going to register their car, and making it super cheap and more attractive for them to invest in. So with that, we're growing, the pot for conservation quite substantially, and we're very excited about it. That was a lot. I'm going to let you pass it on now.
No, that was great. If we're extending this metaphor of chefs in kitchens, I think you are the Michelin star recipes.
I'm a terrible
Mac and cheese all the way. No, I think you laid out a bunch of really interesting, innovative, and creative examples. I remember I lived in Colorado years ago before I worked in conservation, and I knew about the great the GOCO because it was just so well advertised and marketed to people like me who like to recreate but weren't working in it. So kudos. I want to transition to Maryland and talk a little bit more about equity and access. And Senator, you mentioned some of these pieces from the Great Maryland Outdoors Act, public water access, storytelling, transportation. And so now that you're at this inflection point of having conserved nearly 2 million acres in Maryland on the way to 40 by 40, what lessons have you learned on the way that you're hoping to apply as you reach that second goal as it relates to access?
Well, similarly, in the pre-call we had, we actually discovered we have similar tensions across every state, and not a new one, but certainly a more a greater pressure now than we've ever had before is around housing, post-pandemic and affordable housing. And so much when we talk about conservation, and you hit the nail on the head, I think we need to have a real conversation with ourselves that not all land is equal in terms of its ecological value. And before Maryland was kind of just grabbing up the cheap parcels, and those aren't always the best parcels for resilience, for biodiversity, or for, we have what kind of led to a lot of this work was deforestation for development in Maryland. And we're kind of back at that place again. And so all of these pressures, we're never going to solve them, but it's all about how do we achieve the best balance. And we did that, I think, with the Great Maryland Outdoors Act. And then we followed up with a revamp of our Forest Conservation Act that hadn't really been touched in 32 years. But we looked at how do we identify priority forest from all the definitions we've talked about today? And then how do we say we need to prioritize that? And then where it's not so much a priority, how do we incentivize multifamily housing and transit-oriented development? Because we can't just ignore the housing crisis, but but if we just decide to, as you mentioned, silo this and only think about each challenge inside of itself, we're not going to achieve anything. And so that's been over the years. It's kind of, I have one or two big environmental bills every year, and they're just kind of building off of the last as a new challenge presents itself. But that's certainly important. We have a different energy issue in Maryland. We don't have the oil and gas, but we do have pressures around generation and around solar. And so that's an added pressure. And then again, post-pandemic, we have an added pressure of food production, which is really important too. And I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but my message to everybody is, all of those are equally important policy priorities for policymakers. And while everybody in this room believes with our whole hearts that conservation, it is important, but it's not more important than affordable housing or more important than food generation or production. So just thinking about that, I'm not quite sure our predecessors thought about the policy challenges in the intersectionality that was mentioned that is required of us moving forward, but really, really important. I think another place for state level expansion is, we have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, we can't be all things to everybody. That's just not, government isn't set up to do that. But we have a lot of great partners who can help fill in those gaps. And so really utilizing the folks in this room and utilizing not just the expertise, but also the sweat equity of that. One piece of the parks bill that I'm really proud of, and, tiny little piece, one staff position, but I think is a real opportunity for growth, is we have a lot of friends of groups of our state parks, all volunteers, incredible humans who have 0.0 support from the state for what they do. And so a position we created in our bill was, how do we have a state person who is their liaison, who is helping to coordinate a lot of their work and bring them together for professional development opportunities, be a conduit for grant opportunities, but just we can really multiply our efforts if we open the door to the nonprofit and NGO community in a more official capacity than we had. So that's a lesson. And again, it's just one staff position, but I think it's really important moving forward that we find those opportunities in our state law and our state government to be better partners.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Jen, I work with a lot of states and state legislators. And when I work with states like Iowa, I'll say, California has this policy you should check out. And they go, okay, great. But like I jest, but it's for good reason, right? Because California was the first state to set a 30 by 30 goal. And under your leadership, you've set out this really incredible specific action plan for implementing that. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about some of the lessons that you learned through that process that might be extrapolable to other states who are looking to kind of either set area-based conservation targets or dive right into an action plan. What did you learn that others can take away?
It's a great question. I should back up and say that, putting together the strategy for 30 by 30 we had about a year. I got a deadline, I think, of 14 months to write the strategy. But it happened to be during COVID, so I was able to do a whole lot of Zoom webinars. So we did 17 public workshops in a year. I was in my little green room, green painted wall with a dartboard behind my head. Everyone in the world and California conservation knows that dartboard, which I've since repainted the room. But in any case, we did 17 workshops, and we had really literally thousands of people tuning in from all over the conservation universe, but also all the people that were worried that this was a giant land grab and all the, the developers, the housing people. There was just a wide array of folks that tuned in. And I think the lesson that I learned, I don't know if I learned a lesson. I mean, we listened a lot. We listened a lot to the concerns. Ultimately, we knew we could not succeed unless we identified this as a voluntary program, right? It had to be voluntary, locally led, very similar to what Chair Mallory was saying. But we also needed to find that sweet spot, sort of to your point. We didn't want to just call everything conserved because, 50% of California is public land. So we were already there. And we already knew that wasn't working for us from a climate perspective or a biodiversity perspective. We're still one of the, fifth biodiversity hotspots on the planet, which means we have more biodiversity under threat than anywhere else, right? So we know even with all of our great laws, we have a lot more work to do. So we were trying to find that way to sort of give ourselves an ambitious goal that would push ourselves, but at the same time, deal with all these other concerns. I'm not sure I'm going to come up with a great answer, but I will say there was a lot of listening. We put out a draft. We took a lot of public comment. But ultimately, I think where we landed with our definition was in a place that is both a strong, high bar for what will count as conserved in California. It has to have an ecosystem benefit, biodiversity benefit, and it has to be durable, it has to last. But pairing that with something that is voluntary, I think creates space for people to say, that's not for me. One thing I'll share about California, and the federal government has this too, is this issue of working through sort of where you do what you do. Right, California has a really incredible database and we have similar to what they rolled out at the federal level, their conservation.gov. We have a California Nature website that's similar. You can look at all the different biodiversity data. You can look at where you have parks. You can look at projections for sea level rise and temperature and sort of game out where conservation is best. But we have a longstanding tradition as well of regional planning, strategic planning that is paired with conservation because of these strong conservation laws. So we have a good history of saying, these are the places we'd like to develop. These are actually the places we need to protect. And that I think is a really important foundation to build on, because you can't just say everything's off limits. Obviously, but you have to be thoughtful about where that development occurs and take advantage of the most strategically important places and protect them. So one thing I will say about that I learned, so I'm trying to think like, what did I actually learn? I'm kind of a lumper by nature. So I'm an ecologist, but I tend to see things in categories. And I think what was valuable about California's 30 by 30 strategy is it really created a common place for everyone to see themselves. We recognize conservation across a fairly broad spectrum. So there are working lands under conservation easement all the way to really highly protected like wilderness areas. So there's a lot of people that can see themselves in that space. And we really wanted folks to sort of drop their jerseys and just recognize that all of us are working in conservation in one way or another. If we're committed to this 30 by 30 goal. We handed out pins, we have bumper stickers and hats. Like the idea is to say, like, we're all part of this movement. Whatever effort you're making is helping us move the needle. And I think that's created a strong voice for conservation across the groups that are working on it. So they're not individually going to the legislature, they're going collectively. And I think that creates more power. But it also gives people sort of an entree into talking to others that maybe don't understand this space. How can you fit in? So.
Thank you. And yeah, 17 public workshops in a full year. I was trying to do, that's a lot of Zoom.
Some of them were like 9 hours long.
That's a lot of hours. Good for you. So we have one more question and then we'll turn it over to the audience to start thinking. I want to kind of continue that thread talking about partnerships and kind of, this is going to be a pretty broad question. So run where you want to run with it. But I'm curious, especially because we have a lot of folks in the room from NGOs and philanthropy. What did strong partnership look like outside of the public sector with businesses, with NGOs, with philanthropy, with private landowners? What did that look like and how did it complement your work? It's broad. So run where you'd like to run with it. Anybody want to start? Representative?
Sure. That's a very big question. So I I think this is where I will focus. Back to the Land of Enchantment Legacy Fund would not have passed. We would not have gotten that money in the budget, and this year it was 300 million. So we're on our way. That goes into a fund that is managed by the State Investment Council, so it doesn't go directly to programs immediately. But we would not have been able to do this without a wide and diverse partnership funded by philanthropy. And I think that's really, really important. We had, big green groups working in New Mexico, supporting this, casting aside differences. I think people came with a focus on how and what we can get done instead of kind of feeding the traditional tensions, which I mean are still there and will always be there. But we could really focus on one thing. So we had philanthropic efforts in the state, Energy Foundation funding stuff, TNC working, national and state-based philanthropists funding local folks to work in this. And you have to pay people to participate. I think that's really, really important, especially in a state like ours where, I think there's a lot of there's this idea that you can get people to volunteer their time because they care so much. And they do care, but they also care about paying their mortgage and help, raising their children and having food on the table. So, I think philanthropy needs to recognize that you have to pay people to participate in real ways for policy change.
I'll build off of that. I completely agree, and I think that's something we in the state kind of undertook an effort called the Environmental Justice Action Task Force, and I was privileged to be a part of that. And I think one of the key recommendations that came out of that was just thinking about those ways of engaging in a more equitable way. And I think something that we've run into in Colorado is kind of stakeholder fatigue. I mean, to your point about, 17 meetings that are hours long. I mean, it's like that's tiring from a staff perspective, but it's also tiring for our stakeholders when we have multiple different agencies that are doing all of that, right? And we're all reaching, in a great way, we're really wanting to engage diverse communities and disproportionately impacted communities. But we're increasingly also needing to be cognizant that a lot of times we're relying on the same people in those communities to come to all the meetings, and that's not their full-time job, right? So completely agree on both of those. And I think there's two other areas that I would just flag kind of from an external NGO philanthropic perspective. One, mentioned LTA. The LTA world, private conservation, as well as like TNC, TPL, see folks from those organizations here. Huge foundational elements to getting stuff done at the state level, right? Like people think of government and they think lots of people, lots of money inside big buildings that we don't understand. It's like, nope, it's us, there's a lot less of us than you think. There's a lot smaller budgets than you think. So the fact that those groups are going out, working on those projects for years and then coming to us being like, hey, we've got this kind of, on a nice silver platter to turn into a state park or work on that next thing, right? That's huge and amazing. And then, again, I think from the equity perspective, we have a lot of coalitions in Colorado that I think are incredibly helpful, Next 100, that are really helping to elevate the conversation around conservation and equity and climate resilience from an equity perspective. So that world is incredibly helpful and really valuable to keep building. But I think the on the ground projects are incredible and should be really focused on from a foundation perspective.
You're going to regret the long runway you gave us, because I'm gonna flip it and say where partnerships can go wrong, if that's okay. I mentioned I do at least one or two big environmental bills every year, and we start early. Our legislative session is January to April, so we start in July building our coalition and holding regular meetings and talking through opportunities and challenges. Where it can go wrong is, and I love your saying about leave your jerseys at the door. And I mentioned, some folks come and they are so convinced that they are right. And their issue is so important, and it is really important, but it's not the only important issue, as I mentioned before. So just asking folks to kind of gut check and appreciate the many pressures we have, policy pressures we have that we're trying our darndest to balance, and we're humans and it's hard. Another place it has gone wrong, in my experience legislatively, is letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Happens so often. And as I tell everybody, and just finished a session, so I've passed 91 bills in 6 years, everyone with bipartisan votes. It is never a perfect bill from the beginning, and it is not a perfect bill at the end. Compromise is inherent to the process. You have to give up things that you love. I had an oyster bill and I gave up like my favorite part of that bill just to get it passed. That's just what you have to do in the legislative process. And a lot of folks understand that and a lot of folks don't. And it makes our jobs really difficult when people don't appreciate the amendment process or the compromise or the deal making and horse trading that I have to do to get a bill passed. And so I just would love it if everybody understood that you have to have your non-negotiables, but you also have to be willing to give up some things to get what you want. And I will always get 75% of what I want instead of 0. And that's my ethos as a legislator. Not everybody feels that way, but it's so the best partners in this process for me are people who understand both of those things from the beginning.
I'm so glad you asked about partnerships because, I mean, my perspective is you can't do any of this work without the partners. It doesn't actually exist without the partners. And those 17 workshops, in fact, were possible because Resources Legacy Fund helped us get consultants to do the job. You can't just turn on a Zoom meeting and hope it's going to go well. You have to have people help you do that. And I was literally a staff of one putting this together, but they helped me hire some writers who could take notes and some people who could make sure the raised hands weren't ignored, but also do a focus on equity and reach out to equity organizations across the state to identify the key meetings that they would come to. We didn't just do every workshop the same. We had regional meetings and then we had expert panels on particular topics. And so they could do outreach in particular to encourage folks to come and then also help them with resources to fund them to participate. Similarly, we now have regional coalitions that they help stand up across the state that continue to advocate on behalf of 30 by 30, a coalition called Power in Nature. And that's philanthropy pulling together all the partners into this sort of space where they can make their voices stronger. And then finally, I didn't talk about this, but, separately working with the California Native American tribes, that is not a public process. That's a private process. That's a government to government conversation that doesn't happen in the public eye. But we also look for ways to help tribes participate with us in those conversations and make it easier and try to have meetings where if there were 4 things that we wanted to talk to them across agency, we'd only meet with them once because it is true. They don't have endless amounts of time to talk to government. But I would say at the end of the day, all the projects that we're doing to achieve 30 by 30, you heard about the monuments, all the land conservation, those are all driven by partners on the ground with the state trying to just put wind in their sails. And so we can't do any of it without them.
Thank you. Before we jump into Q&A, can y'all give it up for our panelists? It is tireless work. You're not having bees and birds come up and knock on your door and say, thank you for protecting me. But know that we appreciate your work. So let's transition to some audience Q&A. I know we also have some folks online. Do we have any online or should we jump right into
Online question first?
online? Okay.
Sorry, my bad. Let me see. So we've got a really good one from Helen Wagenvoort. I'm so sorry. I probably said your name wrong. Question for the group, whoever wants to take it. How would you define conservation with respect to agricultural lands?
Can I take that? I think this is the Helen Wagenvoort that I worked with like 20 years ago who from Resource Legacy Fund, maybe, is that right? But I'm going to start that. Like, we cannot have good food without good soil and good water. They are inextricably linked, and we have to stop siloing and focus on how we can protect our working lands and our streams, and our habitat all together forever. I'm just going to end there.
I couldn't agree with you more. And so often, especially in the Chesapeake Bay movement, we've kind of vilified farmers and farms for a long time. I'm not sure how it works in other states and areas, but we need to do a better job of helping them do better. And I a couple bills this year around funding not just one best management practice on a farm at one time, but crazy thought, maybe we do 3 or more, and maybe we prioritize along watersheds that have the most ecological value, and we can get creative. And I think you've heard a theme here of like doing more than one thing at once, and rising to not just 30 by 30, but a biodiversity goal and a reforestation goal and all a clean water goal. We can get more creative, and the agricultural community is so essential on that. So a huge part of conservation. But once a farmer is willing to partner with government, that's not always easy. And we need to make it easier for them to take advantage of every possible opportunity.
I just want to add, so we set this really high bar for what counts for our 30% that we're trying to achieve in California, but we made a big point of saying all those really highly protected areas exist in a matrix of other stuff, right? So, and we laid out 10 pathways to achieve 30 by 30. They're all sort of parallel ways you can get more acres. But one of them is pathway 9, which is complementary conservation, and the importance of investing in healthy soils, in pollinators, in, on-farm practices that will improve water and air and soil health and help us with our carbon goals. And we invested in that as well in California. So, and when we finally talked to farmers at first, they were like, what's this 30 by 30? What are you doing? And then we would talk and they would be like, oh, that's good. I'm good with that. Like, they don't want to have durably protected stuff in one form. They want to have the flexibility to do the work they do when we want that, but also the incentives to improve their practices and be recognized for the good work that they do.
Yeah, and I'll add from Colorado. I mean, I think we're a state where it's never been something that's mutually exclusive. It's always really been one and the same. I mean, our agricultural partners are some of the best conservationists that we have in the state. And that is from a water perspective. That is from, and there's just a ton of innovation in that space. But from a landscape perspective, I think echoing, the other panelists, it's about getting into the details and figuring out what is the conservation value of a specific area or land, and then working with that landowner to realize the conservation value of that need. And so for us, just this last year, a couple years ago, we really enhanced the conservation easement tax credit program in the state up to a 90% level. We've walked it back a little bit this year. It was very popular. But in doing that, kind of fine-tuned it a little bit around areas with like refundability and some other kind of elements of the tax credit itself to really even heighten that conservation value in a more detailed and specific way for places that we wanted included in it, newer areas that might not be under traditional kind of threats or specific outcomes that we were kind of like looking for. I'll also just add that we have a soil health program that is also, and this year we passed a sustainability, an ag sustainability tax credit that's really also aimed at kind of reaching a gap where NRCS might not reach some folks, but we want specific conservation outcomes in specific places that also benefit the producer and benefit the landowner, right? And so, for Colorado, we have amazing mountains and amazing, forests, but our biggest carbon sink opportunities and most important, from a resilience perspective, a lot of times are our Eastern Plains agricultural lands. And so it's a huge opportunity need and just ongoing long-term partnership with, I think a community that rightly recognizes that it's an opportunity for them too.
Agreed. Yeah, it's not an accident that 1 out of every 3 bites of food is due to pollinators, and a big prerequisite to healthy pollinators is healthy land and soils and water. So appreciate that question.
Anyone in the room? If you don't mind stating your name and affiliation for your question.
Hi, I'm Steve Blackledge with Environment America. I'm based in California. My question is something like this. Do we have opportunities to use either interesting or iconic wildlife to focus the public and focus policies on land conservation. So I'm thinking maybe wolverines in Colorado. I'm thinking maybe beaver relocation in California. I'm thinking of bumblebees and other insects and critters everywhere.
Can I take this? Because I have really strong opinions about this. Yes, and I think the environmental community has done a disservice to ecology by focusing on individual species. And I say this as an ecologist. I think we have focused on the cute face and the individual and not told the story of why these organisms are part of a larger web of life. And so I used to work in endangered species conservation when I was at Fish and Wildlife Service. And, the first question every time we wanted to list a species, well, what is it good for? Why do we care about that? And by focusing on the individual, we've kind of, if it's not cute or it's not, doesn't pollinate our food, if we can't come up with a specific purpose, nobody cares about it. So yes, I think we need to do that, but I think we need to do it in the context of telling the story of how essential they are for the functional ecosystem. Like I want to do a better job of helping people see that conservation is not a nice to have. It's not about recreation, although I love recreation. It's actually about the future of humanity, that we have a functional planet. And that is the mantra that I've been pushing now that I'm freed from not being a federal employee. I'm just out there saying this all day long, which is we aren't going to make it as a species. This Earth is a giant interconnected set of ecosystems. And every time we destroy one, at some point, the whole thing's going to stop working. And we're already seeing this. We're already seeing it in real time. We just won't recognize it. So yes, but I want to do a much better job of helping people understand why these species matter from a much, broader perspective. Let's work on that together.
100, as my teen would say, whatever that means.
Yes, but also learn from Maryland and the Bay. We have all of our iconic keystone species are kind of water-based. And so we started the movement thinking about what we call living resources. And then we kind of got really wonky and technical and moved over to TMDL and sediment and nitrogen and phosphorus. And we've removed it so far from the human experience because you can only see 2 of our 3 indicators with your eyes, but animals can see it. But my point is we are starting to move back towards living resources again, but much more in a habitat is important for them to thrive. And also their healthy habitat is really good habitat for us to recreate with too.
100 again. I'll just add to that, pointing out specifically with huge kudos to both my boss and his partner, Marlon, who is just like such a focused and passionate advocate around wildlife issues, and just gets in the weeds, and both of them get so excited about this. And so that has, I think, driven a ton of innovation in our state and a ton of progress and passion. And our CPW folks are endlessly tired, and they're doing incredible work because of it, right? And so I think to your point, Steve, yes, I think there are opportunities. We should be thinking, right, like the NGO space, we're all, I think, maybe don't give ourselves enough credit sometimes, where people care about the things that we care about, right? And that's okay. We're not always the tiny underdog in the back who's just always losing, even though it feels like that sometimes. So from a PR perspective, I think totally, let's find opportunities where we can use them, be creative with those, look for those kind of messaging opportunities. But I completely agree that I think continuing to try and push the conversation back to a holistic perspective and a de-siloed perspective and an ecosystem perspective gives, those folks that are excited about that cool, for Colorado's perspective, the wolverine, right? We would love nothing more. And my bosses, had these ideas and wants to figure it out, right? Where we passed a bill this year to allow for us to reintroduce the wolverine in Colorado. And they did a bill signing on top of Loveland Pass, which is 13,000. Well, it's not, it's maybe 12,000 feet. And it's not summer there yet at 12,000 feet in Colorado, but they brought up, you know, a stuffed Wolverine from Colorado Parks and Wildlife to the top of Loveland Pass for the bill signing, like really excited about it. And, you know, he wants to bring Hugh Jackman out and do like a Wolverine themed like thing. So we're all about those messaging kind of things. But I think, you know, to the point, keeping it, being able to bring that link back to people that like, we're not just talking about one species, we're talking about like our ecosystem, which is all our species, including our species, is really important. And for Colorado, you know, CSU and my boss and Marlon are, you know, very invested in, not invested, but very excited about the One Health kind of, you know, perspective, especially coming out of the pandemic, right? Like everything's connected, and like let's be making those links for people.
That is actually all the time that we have. I'm sorry. I hate
We
to
can
be
go
very
longer.
bad news. Bad news.
Having so much fun. Well, folks will be around after. Thank you so much. Before we applaud our phenomenal panelists, I just want to kind of wrap with some themes that I think I've been hearing and leave you to ponder. I think 100 on not sleeping on states, right? Like we talk a lot about federal initiatives, and that is all well and good. And we have lots and lots of other legislatures and agencies doing really incredible, innovative work that is scalable to other states and to the federal level. And we're seeing that in real time. November is a big month for many states as well. And many states are going into their long legislative sessions, which is what, like 2 weeks for New Mexico? No, 90 days. So 30 or 60 rather, which is wild. And a lot of the states are pre-filing or starting to pre-file soon. It sounds like July is a big month for Maryland when it comes to thinking through the seeds to plant for January through April. So I would encourage everybody in this room to engage in your own state in a way that makes sense to you, and start thinking about what's going to happen in January, because it's going to be a pretty big year. And I just appreciate you all being here and all the work that you all do to make this come to life. And so we hope you learned something today. I certainly did. But with all that ado, thank you so much to our panelists. Let's give it up. And we invite you to hang out and grab some beverages and chat and scheme and learn from our panelists. Thank you.